The story of the scramble for Africa begins in a quiet room far from the continent itself. A group of powerful men sit around a long wooden table. The curtains are shut. A large map of Africa is spread out in front of them. None of these men has lived in Africa. Most have never stepped foot there. Yet they point at rivers, mountains, and forests as if they know them well. They draw borders with calm confidence. They divide entire regions with straight lines. Millions of people will be affected by these decisions, but none of them are here. The men talk about trade routes, natural resources, and strategic locations. They speak as if the land is empty, waiting to be claimed. This moment sets the stage for one of the most aggressive power grabs in modern history. To understand how things reached this point, we need to look at Europe in the 1800s. Europe was changing fast. Industrial machines were spreading. Factories needed more raw materials. Markets needed more buyers. Nations wanted to prove their strength after years of war and rivalry. While Europe needed new opportunities, Africa had resources that seemed endless. Gold, rubber, ivory, minerals, fertile land, and millions of potential laborers or consumers. European governments and companies looked at Africa with growing interest, but they also used ideas of superiority to justify their actions. They convinced themselves that they had a duty to take control, even though that belief had no real truth behind it. At first, Europe's involvement in Africa was slow. Explorers traveled inland, some motivated by curiosity, others by profit. Missionaries built outposts. Traders set up stations along coasts and rivers. But these first steps were not innocent. Every explorer's report was sent back to Europe and studied carefully. They mapped key rivers and resource-rich regions. They described the political structures they found, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. All of this information helped Europe plan how to take power when the time came. African societies were strong and organized long before European powers pushed inside. There were kingdoms, empires, and communities with clear political systems. Trade networks stretched across the continent. People had their own ways of managing disputes, forming alliances, and protecting their land. But Europe rarely acknowledged this. Instead, they acted as if Africa was uncontrolled and needed new leadership. This idea made it easier for them to justify the coming takeover. By the mid-1800s, Europe's interest in Africa became sharper, and one man accelerated the entire process: King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold wanted a colony he could control personally. He focused on the Congo. To gain support, he presented himself as someone who wanted to help Africa grow. He talked about humanitarian missions and development, even though his real motive was profit and power. He funded expeditions to set up posts, negotiate treaties, and force control where necessary. When other European powers noticed his progress, they feared being left behind. This fear turned into a fierce race. France, Britain, Germany, Portugal, and Italy all wanted their own territories. They moved quickly to claim land before their rivals could reach it. Their competition caused confusion and conflict. Treaties overlapped. Flags were raised and torn down. Soldiers clashed in some areas. Europe needed a plan to prevent fights among themselves, not to protect Africans, but to protect their own interests. That need led to the Berlin Conference in 1884. European leaders gathered in Germany to organize their takeover of Africa. No African leader was invited. The discussions lasted months. They talked about borders, access to rivers, and how to avoid conflict among themselves. The most important rule they agreed on was that no claim would be recognized unless the claiming nation showed actual control over the area. This rule turned the competition into a full-speed race. European powers rushed to send soldiers, administrators, traders, and missionaries deeper into the continent to plant flags and enforce authority. This sudden rush had heavy consequences. European forces pushed into African territories with little warning. Battles broke out in many regions. Some African leaders resisted with strength and strategy, but European weapons were more advanced. Others signed agreements believing they were entering partnerships, only to find out later that they had handed over control. Some were forced into submission. The process was fast, aggressive, and often violent. Once control was established, European governments handed large powers to private companies. These companies were given permission to collect resources with little oversight. In many places, forced labor became common. Workers were pushed into mines, forests, and plantations under harsh conditions. Families were separated. Communities were uprooted. Resources flowed out of Africa at high speed, enriching European industries while weakening local systems that had existed long before. The Congo became one of the darkest examples. Under Leopold's rule, rubber extraction was enforced through extremely cruel methods. Villages were punished when production targets were not met. Violence and fear spread across the region. Although some reports reached Europe, powerful figures tried to hide the truth. Most countries preferred to protect their political and economic interests rather than intervene. This silence allowed the suffering to continue for many years. The scramble for Africa reshaped the continent in ways that remain visible today. One major result was the creation of artificial borders. These borders did not match cultural, ethnic, or historical lines. Entire communities were split apart. Groups with long-standing rivalries were forced under the same administration. These divisions became sources of tension that would later turn into conflicts after independence. Colonial rule also changed political structures. Traditional leaders were removed or weakened. Some were replaced with leaders who supported European interests, creating new power imbalances. Social systems that had existed for centuries were disrupted. Education, language, and religion were reshaped to follow European models. Many African knowledge systems were ignored or erased. This created identity challenges that would last for generations. The economic impact was also deep. Africa was not developed to benefit Africans. It was reorganized to supply raw materials to Europe. Local industries were restricted. Many areas became focused on a single resource or crop, making their economies fragile. When independence finally came in the mid-1900s, these economic weaknesses remained. Countries struggled to rebuild balanced systems after years of extraction. Despite all of this, Africans did not lose their strength or identity. People resisted in many ways. Some took up arms. Others resisted through culture, education, and spiritual traditions. They protected their languages, values, and stories. Their determination became the foundation of the independence movements that rose across the continent in the 20th century. These movements were long and difficult. Many lives were lost, but they eventually pushed colonial powers out. Independence brought hope, but also challenges. The borders drawn during the scramble remained. The economic structures remained. The political divisions remained. Countries had to rebuild with systems that had never been designed for them in the first place. But they pushed forward. They built new governments. They formed new identities. They worked to reconnect with histories that had been interrupted. The scramble for Africa is not just a story of the past. Its effects are still present in modern politics, society, and development. The decisions made in those quiet rooms continue to shape relationships, opportunities, and conflicts. This story helps us understand how Africa reached where it is today. It shows how much was taken, but also how much was preserved through resilience and strength. Understanding what really happened behind closed doors is important because it exposes the truth behind one of the most significant events in world history. It helps us see the forces that shaped the continent and the long road Africans traveled to reclaim their future. The scramble for Africa was not just about land. It was about power, control, and the right to decide the direction of a people. And today, Africa continues to rise with that history behind it, not as a burden, but as a reminder of how far it has come.